everybody. I am delighted to welcome you all here this evening to hear Professor Ken Miller talk to us about the cosmos, about Darwin, about evolution, about God. This lecture is being generously paid for by the Templeton Foundation as the beginning of the Magi Project. It's being co-hosted by the Collegiate Institute for Catholic Thought on Campus and by PREX, which is a program for religious research and religion in the urban civil setting, by the Penn Laboratory for the Understanding of Science, and by the Penn Forum for Philosophy, Ethics and Public Affairs. So I'm very happy to welcome you all tonight. The program for tonight is we're going to have Professor Miller talking first, and then we're going to have a few comments afterwards by Professor Michael Weisberg from the Penn Laboratory on the Understanding of Science, and then we're going to take questions from the floor. I'm going to give Professor Miller a very, very brief introduction. Okay, he told me to keep it short. I first met Professor Miller when I heard him speak at a big meeting in Chicago, and I felt really inspired and enthused by his lecture, and I thought that you'd all like to hear him talk too. So I invited Ken, and I invited all of you, and I'm really happy you can be here. So Professor Miller has got this very important position at Brown University, where he did his undergraduate, but had a brief time out at Harvard as a assistant professor, I'm not sure, and then later returned to Brown as with a very sort of fancy endowed chair. He's the winner of numerous awards. If you were at high school, if you remember high school, or you're a high school teacher, you may remember the Miller and Levine biology textbooks. This is the Miller from Miller and Levine. So that's who he is. You may remember the Kitts-Miller v. David trial about intelligent design and evolution in schools. Well, again, Professor Miller played a pivotal role in that debate. He's also advisor to PBS, the NewsHour, and there are probably many others I could say. I should mention also he's an Eagle Scout, which is a very, very important qualification. So please, one round of applause, warm welcome to Professor Ken Miller.
Marissa, thank you very much for that overly generous introduction. I wasn't aware that my youth was going to come into this in terms of scouting. I could even show you some pictures at summer camp, but I suspect that's not why you came here. It is an absolute pleasure to be back at Penn. And the last time I was here, as several of your faculty reminded me, it was to participate in the Year of Evolution, a remarkable scientific celebration here at Penn in 2009. And I had the very great honor of delivering the keynote address for that two-day meeting. This is actually my slide, my title slide from that talk a number of years ago. And as I'll try to emphasize, it was particularly important to me to come back to the state of Pennsylvania in the aftermath of the trial that you heard about, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the trial now. I'll tell you a little bit in a little bit, and you'll see how this fits into my theme. But first of all, I have to explain to you how I got interested, not just in science and faith, but in defending the idea of evolution. And it sort of goes back to 1982. I'm a cell biologist. I work with the electron microscope, and I work on the structure and function of biological membranes. So I'm sitting in my laboratory at Brown. That device, by the way, is a high vacuum device called a freeze etching machine. We use it to prepare specimens for the electron microscope. And I was feeling very, very full of myself at the moment this picture was taken, because my department was about to vote for tenure on my case. And it just so happened that my lab had the cover story in the journal Nature the very same week that the tenure committee met. And of course, I bought extra copies of Nature and made sure that everybody knew who had that cover story. And for those of you who are in grad school or postdocs, this timing is everything in an academic career. But in any event, one day I'm in the lab. About this time, the phone rings, and on the phone is a former student of mine. Now, his name is Joe Levine. He's only 3 years younger than me, but he actually had been a student and a teaching assistant of mine at Harvard before I returned to Brown. And he had been approached by a publisher, and he said, "Do you want to write a high school biology textbook?" And I grew up across the river in New Jersey. And any of you who know New Jersey know that by definition that makes me a smartass. So my immediate response to Joe was, what are you, nuts? Actually, it was a little coarser than that. But I'm pleased to say that Joe was very persistent. And he pushed me and pushed me and pushed me. And within 6 months, I finally said, okay, I give up. Let's go ahead and do this, and we'll split the book, and we'll go to work on this. And the result was our very first book, what was published a mere 8 years later. It's generally known as the Elephant Book. Some of you in the room may have seen it on a bookshelf and so forth, but one of the prices you pay for having a successful textbook in science, which changes so much, is you then get to write it again. And when science changes, you get to write it again. And when it changes, you get to write it again. And this past year, so much has changed that we decided we had to write it yet again. And some of the young people in the room may recognize some of the covers on these books. And you might wonder, does an author ever know what effect his writing, his textbooks have on people? Well, my oldest daughter, Lauren, I've been blessed with 2 daughters. My oldest daughter, Lauren, managed to graduate from Dighton-Rehoboth Regional High School in Massachusetts, where we lived before my first book came out. Tracy, my younger daughter, not so lucky. And she had to suffer the indignity of using her old man's textbook for freshman honors biology. And there are a lot of fun stories about that first year, but I'll tell you the one that's always stuck with me. At the time this book came out, Rehoboth, Massachusetts is a very small town, about 8,000 people. And at the time the book came out, an awful lot of people in the town knew me, but not because of what I do for a living. They knew me because for about 8 or 9 years, I was kind of like the commissioner of the girls' softball program. So I ran the spaghetti suppers to raise money. I trained our umpires. I used to coach one of our all-star teams in the summer. So they all knew me as a softball guy. They didn't really know what I did for a living. And then one day the high school adopted the book. My name was on the cover. My picture was inside. And all of a sudden people knew, oh, that was me. So about a month into that school year, I'm driving up to the high school to pick Tracy up after field hockey practice. And there's a woman I know from softball, another coach, Bonnie Kelly was her name, in front of the high school. She sees my little pickup truck, and she waves me down, and I figure I'll go over there. So pull the truck up, roll down the window, and say, hey, Bonnie, what's up? And very excitedly, she says, Ken, you wrote the book they're using in the high school. And I, when he said I was very proud, I puffed out my chest a little bit. I gave a smug smile, and I said, yes, I did. And then Bonnie looked me straight in the eyes, and she said, funny thing is, you don't seem that smart. There are things that people tell you that stick with you. That was basically one of those things. But what does this have to do with the issue of science and faith? Well, our books turned out to be very popular, used all over the country. And in the early 2000s, the school board in Cobb County, Georgia, decided to use our book for all 13 of their high schools. Mrs. Miller was delighted with the royalties, and because it fit the Georgia curriculum so well. But it turns out that in reviewing the book, a number of people in town, including one very prominent clergyman, discovered that our book had an entire unit on evolution. And he launched a petition drive that gathered over 2,000 signatures to have our book taken off the approved list. Now, the school board decided not to do that, but they wanted to mollify the irate citizens, so they decided to put a warning label on our textbook, kind of like on a pack of cigarettes. And this is the actual warning label. This textbook has material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Well, an awful lot of people in the school district saw this as a blatant attempt to undermine this scientific idea for religious reasons. And they filed a lawsuit against the school board. I happened to be, without not knowing about the lawsuit, I happened to be at Georgia State University giving a scientific seminar, and the lead plaintiff in the case, a guy named Jeff Selman, at the end of my seminar introduced himself to me and said, we're going to trial in September. Could you fly down to Atlanta in federal court and testify? And I said, sure. So lo and behold, I did. And that's Jeff right there with his attorney. We won the case. It was a very clear First Amendment violation because the intent of the petition signers was, quite frankly, to put God in the science classroom, and they said as much. And that made it a rather easy case for the court. Here is a news article from the Associated Press. As you can see, because I testified on the very first day of the trial, my name ended up in the first sentence of an AP story that appeared in about 1,000 newspapers the next morning. Man, you should have seen what my email inbox looked like the next day. Any number of people sought to advise me on where I was likely to spend eternity. They said there was no need for someone like you, no need for warm clothing. I still remember. I still remember one of those emails. But that was just my introduction to the sensitivity with which people of faith regard evolution. So I might ask you, well, why is biology such a big deal? And I think one of the ways to explain that is to look at what some scientists say about the theory of evolution. This is a op-ed piece from the New York Times, written by a very distinguished biologist, David Barash, at the University of Washington, really first-rate scientist. And he's also a teacher, and you can see the op-ed article he wrote. And he said, every year around this time, I give my students the talk. It's not, as you might expect, about sex, but it's about evolution and religion and how they get along, or, more to the point, how they don't. And what Dr. Barash pointed out is many Americans don't grasp the fact that evolution is not just a theory, it's the underpinning of everything in biological science, and I certainly agree with that. But a substantial number of his students are troubled to discover that their religious beliefs conflict with the course material. And here's what he says: the more we know about evolution, the more unavoidable is the conclusion that we human beings were produced by a totally natural, amoral process with no indication of a benevolent, controlling creator. And Dr. Barash basically thinks that's why evolution and religion don't get along. Now that's the question I want to address right now. And I want to talk about science in general, but evolution in particular. So in order to make sure I'm using the right terms, I went to that ultimate authority. You all use it. You all know what it is. It's Wikipedia. And this is the Wikipedia definition of science. And considering how bad Wikipedia is on some things, this ain't bad in terms of a definition. It builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. Well, I think that's a halfway decent explanation of science. Then I decided I'm going to look up religion as well. What does it say about religion? It says an organized collection of beliefs, cultural systems, and worldviews that relate humanity to an order of existence. It doesn't seem that different to me, except for the testability over here. But there's an enormous congruence between those two definitions, or so it seems to me. And that's what I want to expand on a bit tonight. And the reason I want to expand upon it is, quite frankly, the predominant view in our culture is that science and faith are in conflict, and they always have been in conflict. Some of you may remember the remake of the Cosmos series that came out in 2014. Those of you of a certain age, and I'm one of those people, remember the original Cosmos series with the incomparable Carl Sagan. I loved it. I watched every episode. Carl Sagan has a worthy successor in Neil deGrasse Tyson, who hosted this series. I love Neil. I can't get enough of him. I want to see him on TV more. He did a wonderful job with this series. But one thing disturbed me about the Cosmos series, and that was the opening. And it began with a God versus science theme. And that theme was illustrated in a cartoon narrative about a 16th century Dominican named Giordano Bruno, who was a philosopher and an astrologer. Finding religious people who were astrologers was not unusual at that time. Well, as it turns out, Bruno was condemned by church authorities, and this is from the Cosmos cartoon. Look how the cartoon represents church authorities. They are almost like devils with eyes glowing in the darkness. And Bruno was condemned and basically burned at the stake in 1600. Cosmos depicted him as a martyr to science because he believed in other worlds, other planets, and so forth. As it turns out, if you actually look up the case, the principal charges against Bruno were not scientific or astronomical in nature, they were for theological heresy. Not that anybody should ever be burned at the stake, but the fact of the matter is this was a doctrinaire religious conflict and not a conflict about science. And I really fault Cosmos for getting that wrong as an opening theme. And to me, it hurt a great deal. Narratives like those in Cosmos present faith as the timeless enemy of basically science and reason. Here's a cartoon. Science is the name of this candle in the darkness. And once again, you see glowing eyes in the darkness saying, hit it with your Bible. As if, again, science is the enemy of faith. And there are examples of this conflict motif everywhere. This is a photograph outside a church in Florida that a friend of mine sent me. You have no idea how many times I've been asked that exact question when I speak publicly about evolution. If man evolved from monkeys, why are monkeys still here? And examples like this reinforce the science versus faith stereotype. And here's the interesting thing. That idea of science versus faith is a recent intellectual development, and a lot of people would trace it to this particular book by Andrew White, published at the end of the 19th century, called A History of Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. Prior to that, basically, if you look at science done in medieval times, the church was largely the funding agency for astronomy, for zoology, for everything else. The church was the principal patron of science. So this was really a revolution in thinking. Oh, and by the way, when I get asked that question, I always have fun with the person who asks it. And I would typically say, sir, I'll answer your question in just a second. But first, I have a question for you. Where did Protestants come from? And the person is usually deeply puzzled. Like, what are you talking about? I said, now, come on. 95 Theses on the church door, Martin Luther. I guess they came from Catholics. Are Catholics still here? That's the answer to why monkeys are still here. Which is monkeys turn into people and therefore vanish, but the primate line split and split again. And that's exactly what happened in Christendom as well, which is one sectarian split after another. But nonetheless, the media really, really like the God versus science theme. Trust me, if you go on a radio talk show and you say we're going to talk about God versus science, man, the switchboard lights up, people have something to say about it. A really good example of this was a print debate in 2006 between Francis Collins, the former head of the Human Genome Project, and the current head of the National Institutes of Health, one of the most important scientists in the United States, and incidentally also an evangelical Christian, and Richard Dawkins, the prolific writer on evolution and also kind of a professional atheist. It's a very interesting dialogue. And I have to say, if you read the dialogue, you'll see that Dawkins sort of stumbles away respecting Francis Collins in a way that he might not have expected going into this debate. And as a result of this stereotype, I often find there's shock and surprise when someone like Pope Francis endorses evolution. And a couple of years ago, very early in his papacy, the Pope was quoted as saying, evolution and the Big Bang are real. And this apparently surprised a lot of people. Pope Francis declares evolution and the Big Bang theory are real, and God is not a magician with a magic wand. Now, I'll have more to say about Pope Francis's attitudes in just a moment, but this is not surprising news. So, in the public sphere, the question I want to address tonight is something I would call compatibility. And what I mean by compatibility is not, and I repeat this, not that you can prove the existence of God through science. That, quite frankly, would be a fool's errand. But rather that science and faith can coexist in peace, respecting and even supporting each other. And that's the thesis that I want to bring to you tonight. Now, an example of conflict is very close to my heart. And that is in 2004, not too far from here, the Dover, Pennsylvania School Board voted to instruct their teachers to prepare a set of lessons on intelligent design in biology classrooms. Intelligent design is an anti-evolution doctrine that basically says the evolutionary mechanism is not sufficient to account for the origin of species, and there must have been some sort of outside force acting outside of nature that designed living organisms the way they were. Now, to their credit, the teachers in Dover, at the risk of losing their jobs, refused to do this. What happened then is remarkable. The school board didn't fire them, but they decided to write their own intelligent design lesson for the biology classes and to purchase classroom sets of an intelligent design textbook. They then asked the teachers to read the lessons to the students. Once again, they refused. So on a certain day, the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, had to be every one of the biology classes and teach them the intelligent design lessons while the teachers literally stood outside in the hallway. At that time, this was actually the scoreboard outside Dover Area High School. A friend of mine snapped that picture and sent it to me and said, "What do you think? Intelligent design won, Darwin nothing." And I said, "Well, I'm an old baseball player, and at least they made us the home team, which means we're going to get to bat in the bottom of the ninth." And indeed, the game was not over, and we did get to bat in the bottom of the ninth. So here's some headlines from the York, Pennsylvania Daily Record talking about this. Now, what happened leading up to this trial is that this case, Kitzmiller versus Dover, fit the stereotype almost perfectly. After this policy was instituted, 11 parents of kids in Dover High School went to Harrisburg and swore out a First Amendment lawsuit against the school board. The first named plaintiff was this unassuming young woman right here in the beige sweater. Her name is Tammy Kitzmiller, so the case is called Kitzmiller versus Dover. It was heard in front of John Jones III, a recently appointed federal judge. Judge Jones is a lifelong Republican. He's a conservative jurist. He was appointed to the bench by President George W. Bush, and the U.S. Senator who recommended Jones for the bench was in fact former Senator Rick Santorum. So Judge Jones has bona fide conservative credentials by every single standard. Time magazine featured the run-up to the trial with a cover story called Evolution Wars. When the trial itself had ended, but before the verdict came in, the New Yorker wrote about this called Darwin in the Dock. There's actually been 4 books written about the trial. Monkey Girl by Edward Humes is one of the best. And just to give you an idea, let me go over here and make sure I know what my next slide is. I want to show you what the first day of the trial was like, because I had the honor, although I'm not really sure that's the right word, of being the lead witness for those 11 parents on the first day of the trial. So this is the NBC TV courtroom sketch of me being cross-examined by attorneys for the school board. These are my textbooks piled up here. This is a book called Finding Darwin's God, which I wrote about the compatibility of evolution and faith, and I was cross-examined on all of these. I expected to give my testimony Monday morning, be cross-examined Monday afternoon, and then fly home so I could teach my 1 o'clock Tuesday cell biology lecture. Didn't work out that way. My cross-examination went on for 9.5 hours. Therefore, I had to cancel the Tuesday lecture because it ran into Tuesday, and I didn't get home until late Tuesday night. When I finally got back to campus, my colleague said, "What was that like, 9.5 hours of cross-examination?" I said, "It was no big deal. It's just like having the oral exam for your PhD over and over and over again." But when I got back to the airport in Providence, I did something I always do in the evening, which is I switched on National Public Radio. And at the very moment I switched it on, I heard a headline. And the headline was, "It's God versus Science in a Pennsylvania courtroom." And that really made me think about what an awful lot of people thought the trial was about. And I'll have more to say about that in just a second. But what I'd like to show you now, I think this is the next slide. Yeah, I'd like to show you a clip from a NOVA program about the trial that will give you an idea of the intensity of feelings in this case. Here it goes.
I believe there is an intelligent design. In the beginning, God created. saying that you don't believe in evolution is almost saying we don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
An extraordinary court case ignites a small town.
I feel like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
And puts science itself on trial.
Very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
Nova reveals the story behind the headlines.
Anywhere you turn, we were getting attacked.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
And probes the question, is intelligent design a scientific alternative to evolution?
Properly the subject of science class.
Or religion in disguise?
It's a violation of everything we need and everything we understand by science.
Judgment Day, intelligent design on trial.
Now, I can see that you think that narration was just dramatic enough. But this was an extraordinary program. It actually won the Peabody Award for Broadcast Journalism, which is sort of the journalist equivalent of the Oscar. It was an incredible event to participate in. And I have to tell you, it went on for a long time. The trial went on for 7 weeks. And you've all seen trials on TV. And on the very last day of a trial, of course, the lead attorneys for both sides get up and they sum up the case to the judge. So the attorney for the Board of Education, the defense in this case, got up to speak to the judge. And he had one of those little calendar books, a dayminder in front of him. And as he stood at the podium before the judge, he started flipping through this thing. Nobody knew what he was doing. And then all of a sudden he looks up and he says, "Your Honor, I don't know if the court is aware of this, but this trial has lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And the judge, with a big grin on his face, leaned forward and smiled and said, "But it wasn't by design." And at that point, we had an idea as to which way things were going. The decision was announced just before Christmas in 2005, and it was very straightforward. The judge said, look, intelligent design is simply not science. This was front page news, not just locally here, but in every place from the New York Times to USA Today. It was the lead story on the nightly news, and it set off celebration among the parents in Dover. And I got a lot of nice emails. I got a couple hostile ones saying, who are you to tell the citizens of Dover what they can put in their biology classes? And my response is, I'm not anybody. I didn't tell them anything. It was the parents of these children who objected, the parents who brought the lawsuit, the parents who wanted authentic science taught in their classrooms. So what I'd love to tell you is that the side against evolution had 3.5 weeks to make their case, and they did. They called every expert witness they wanted. They simply fell on their faces. Everyone in the courtroom realized that they were contradicting themselves, that they had no scientific basis for this, and the decision, quite frankly, was a grand slam for those of us who wish to protect evolution from religious intrusion. Now, here's the interesting thing. In reality, this was actually not a God versus science case. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. The judge himself was a Christian. He's a Lutheran, a church-going, active Lutheran, I would add. There were 6 of us who were expert witnesses. 3 of us were people of faith. And one of us, my colleague John Haught, is actually a professor of sacred theology at Georgetown University. And these are on our side of the case. 7 of the 11 plaintiffs were themselves Christians, and 2 of them were actually Sunday school teachers. So the notion that this was God versus science is completely bogus. There was something else going on here. Now, as I mentioned, I'd love to pretend that Kitzmiller settled the issue. It certainly has in eastern Pennsylvania, but that's not true everywhere. Here, for example, are some headlines from the great state of Texas, and believe me, Texans in particular know that Kitzmiller versus Dover did not settle the case. The Texas School Board has tremendous power over the content of textbooks, and they basically flagged one biology textbook in particular over evolution concerns because they said it makes too strong a case for evolution. I wonder if you can guess who wrote that one textbook, which it's ours. That's Miller and Levine, that's our Texas edition, and ours was the textbook they flagged. Now, as it turns out, the school board, bless their hearts, actually did something right. which is they decided to send our textbook to the chairs of the biology departments at University of Texas, Texas A&M, and Baylor University, and ask them, does this book contain the errors that the critics of evolution say? Well, as it turns out, all three of the biology departments got back and said, this is a great book. They're not errors. This basically gives the story of science well. And I have to tell you, I'm good friends with some of the competing authors who have written other books. And in the midst of this little controversy, which lasted almost a month, one of them, a guy named David Hillis from the University of Texas, called me up and he said, Ken, is there anything you can do to get the school board to condemn my textbook as well? And the reason for that, he says, for the past 4 weeks, your book is the only one that anybody has talked about and everybody wants to look at. It was the best free publicity ever. And in fact, we did very well in the Texas adoptions. But even in Texas, it's not over. Just in the past year, there's been a new wave of anti-evolution bills hitting one state after another. So this concern about evolution and its religious content is widespread and continuing. Now, why is it? Well, I have to say, I appreciate the fact that scientific concepts like evolution and the Big Bang still remain troubling issues for people of faith, especially for Christians. And I want to show you a little clip from another NOVA program, years before the Kenneth Miller trial, actually, that was on evolution and faith and asks the big question. You'll see what I mean by the big question now.
The majesty of our earth, the beauty of life, are they the result of a natural process called evolution, or the work of a divine creator? This question is at the heart of a struggle that has threatened to tear our nation apart.
That's an outdated religious book. Science has shown you
For
can't.
fundamentalist Christians like Ken Ham, evolution is an evil that must be
You
fought.
can't hold up your moral hand.
Well, I think it's a war. It's a real battle between worldviews.
For embattled teachers in Lafayette, Indiana, evolution is a truth that must be defended.
I think they think someone will come out a victor, and I don't believe that that's going to be the case.
If you look at the Bible,
For Christian students at Wheaton College, evolution is an idea that is hard to accept.
Where is God's place if everything does have a natural cause?
For all of us, the future of religion, science, and science education are at stake in the creation-evolution debate. Today, even as science continues to provide evidence supporting the theory of evolution, for millions of Americans, the most important question remains: what about God?
And that was the title of this episode, What About God? So the question is, how can people of faith reconcile themselves to ideas like evolution or the Big Bang? So I want to start with the Big Bang first. And I want to throw out kind of a rhetorical quiz. And that is, who is it who actually developed the mathematical foundations of cosmic expansion, which we properly call the Big Bang? Now, it turns out that the implications for an expanding universe are found in Einstein's equations for general relativity. But Einstein himself resisted that idea. And he resisted it for what you might call anti-theological reasons. Einstein was not a person of faith. And he wanted to believe in a steady-state universe. A universe that always was and always would be. And therefore, he never had to think about where did it come from. Does it have a creator? Is there a first cause? But a young professor of mathematics and physics from Belgium, from the University of Louvain, came to these conferences and showed Einstein that his own equations implied an expanding universe. There's that young professor. And you might notice that he's wearing a clerical collar, which is one of the reasons Einstein was suspicious. That person is a Belgian priest named Georges Lemaitre, and Georges Lemaitre is the scientific father of the Big Bang. He, in fact, worked out the mathematics that showed we have an expanding universe. Later on, when he was an older man, basically Penzias and Wilson developed the empirical evidence for the Big Bang background radiation, and they confirmed what Lemaitre had shown much earlier on a theoretical basis. There's a couple of wonderful books about Lemaitre. One is called The Atom of the Universe. Another one is written by a friend of mine named John Farrell, called The Day Without Yesterday, Lemaitre, Einstein, and the Birth of Modern Cosmology. And Father Lemaitre is one of the great scientific pioneers of 20th century physics. And many people, he remained a priest throughout his life, and many people would ask him, how can you read Scripture and be at home with the notion that we live in an ancient and expanding universe? And these are quotes from Farrell's book. Lemaitre said, look, the writers of the Bible were illuminated more or less, some more than others, on the question of salvation. But on other questions, on scientific questions, they were just as wise or just as ignorant as other people of their generation. And then he says, the idea that the authors of Scripture were right in the doctrine of immortality and salvation, they must therefore be right on all other subjects, is simply the fallacy of people who have an incomplete understanding of why the Bible was given to us at all. And Lemaitre, a faithful priest his whole life, was the first person to say the Bible is not a textbook of science. It is a book of faith. So what about Pope Francis? I told you I would come back to him. It's generally not appreciated that Pope Francis was trained as a chemist. He's a Jesuit. The Jesuit order is particularly friendly to science and has been throughout its entire history. Jesuits have been outspoken in their support of science, including evolution. During the evolution battles we had in the United States in the early 2000s, one of my most trusty allies was Father George Coyne, who was the head of the Vatican Observatory. And Father Coyne and I often made common cause for the integrity of science in American classrooms. When Pope Francis made those remarks, I was actually called up by both Time and Newsweek. And both reporters said, isn't this remarkable? What can you say about the church reversing its position? And to both of them I said, it didn't reverse its position. He is the fourth pope to speak out in support of evolution. This is really not news. Well, as it turns out, Time wasn't interested in hearing that. They hung up on me, and they didn't quote me. They found somebody who said, this is remarkable. Newsweek in their international edition, bless their hearts, did in fact do exactly that, basically saying they're really not controversial. Among Catholics, they quote me, and they also quote my friend John Haught. John was the theologian with whom we participated in the Kenneth-Miller trial, and Professor Haught at Georgetown said pretty much the same thing. Here is an article from a UK magazine saying the same thing. His comments on the Big Bang are not revolutionary, and that reporter had the integrity to point out they are simply in keeping with the scientific tradition that produced Father George Lemaitre. And that's absolutely and positively true. Even Pope Benedict spoke out on this. He's one of my favorites on this. He's written a number of books about creation and the cosmos. And he was asked in 2007 by a group of Italian journalists if a Catholic could believe in evolution, if there was a conflict. And he was quoted as saying this: the contrast between evolution and creation is absurd, because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution, which appears as a reality which we must see and enriches our understanding of life and being. Popes tend to speak in convoluted language. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. This is sort of like Pope speak. So if you want a publication to untangle that for you, do what I do. Go to the publication that always clears it up for me, and it sure did in this case. That's the New York Post. Evolution and God do mix. Pope. You gotta love the New York Post. Okay? Now, as it turns out, it's not just religious people who feel that way. This is a letter from Charles Darwin. More than 4,000 of Darwin's letters survive. And this is in response to a gentleman named John Fordyce. And John Fordyce had written Darwin asking him to affirm that no Christian could possibly be an evolutionist. Now, Darwin, at the end of his life, was no longer a Christian, so he wasn't making the case himself. But I should also tell you that Charles Darwin was unfailingly polite in his correspondence. He never got harsh with people. He never called them names, anything like that. But look at how he began his letter to Fordyce. He said, "Dear sir, it seems to me absurd," that's pretty harsh language, to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. And then he went on to cite somebody else. He said, Asa Gray, the eminent botanist, is another case in point. Asa Gray is an American scientist who ought to be a whole lot more famous than he is. He's the founder of the botanical societies in science in the United States. He established the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, the Harvard Herbarium, went all over the United States, popularizing Darwin's theory of evolution because he saw the science behind it was sound, and he was also a deacon and an elder in the Presbyterian Church. And Darwin was not a religious person himself at this point, but Darwin was fully aware that Gray was, and that Gray saw no conflict between his faith and the theory of evolution. Here's a more current example. This is Theodosius Dobzhansky, probably the greatest evolutionary geneticist of the 20th century, that made so many contributions it would fill a book. He wrote a very famous article in 1975. The title of the article says everything. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. If you go to the Great Hall of Life Sciences at Notre Dame University, it's only a few years old, it's a beautiful facility. You walk in, on the floor, those words are embossed. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. But you read the article, it's very interesting. Dobzhansky says the diversity of life is reasonable and understandable. If the Creator made the living world, not by caprice, I would say not by intelligent design, but by evolution propelled by natural selection, it is wrong to hold creation and evolution mutually exclusive. And then he goes, I, Dobzhansky, am a creationist and an evolutionist. That's because Dobzhansky was a Christian. And he said evolution is God's or nature's method of creation. Creation is not something that happened 4,000 years ago. It's a process that began some 10 billion years ago and still is underway today. So you hear from religious people and you hear from scientific people. Now, what about the universe itself? This is one of my favorite cosmological pictures. It's from the Deep Field camera in Hubble. It's focused on an area of space that used to be nothing but haze. With the resolution of Hubble, you can see that that haze is filled with galaxies. And every one of these things you see is a galaxy containing, on the average, 100 billion stars. The vastness of the cosmos is absolutely amazing. Now, what does all of this tell us? How does science weave into this? I make a couple of points here. We know that life is a material phenomenon. This is, by the way, one of the few things that Madonna consistently gets right. And that means that the very capacity for life is built into the physics and chemistry of matter. And that means that evolution is an inherent and predictable part of nature. It's not a contradiction. It comes right out of the natural world. If the ultimate cause of the natural world is the will of God, then this logically means that evolution simply reflects His creative power. And that is how evolution can be understood. Is there a design to life? You bet there is. In a very real sense, an evolutionary design to life is part of the inherent fabric of the natural world. So the lesson is the capacity for evolutionary change is actually built into nature. And that allows people of faith, it allows believers to understand that capacity as part of God's providential plan. I'm not the only person who feels that way. This is a very, very famous paleontologist at Cambridge University, Simon Conway Morris. The biologists in the room will know that Conway Morris led the major reinterpretation of the Burgess Shale formation that revolutionized our understanding of Cambrian era animals 550 million years ago. Simon is also a Christian, and he's argued basically that the emergence of a creature like us was baked into the cake from the very beginning in terms of the laws of physics and chemistry that played out in the evolutionary process in this planet. So, people often ask me, if you're a Christian, how do you find room for God? Where do you find God sticking His fingers into the soup? And my answer is we don't have to find room for God in the evolutionary process, because if God exists, the process itself is part of a natural world of His making. So we do not have to find a subversion of the laws of physics and chemistry in order to attribute them to the divine. Now, some people might say, what kind of God would there be in a scientific world in which nature is predictable, there are rules that we can study, describe, and understand? And the answer is very straightforward from my point of view, and that is a God who fashioned the world that is rational and intelligible. So to people of faith, God is not the antithesis of scientific reason. We should understand him as the reason why science works in the first place. And that's a point that I want to reiterate in a different context. Now, there are organizations devoted to basically spreading the good word on this. One is the Clergy Letter Project. Another one is an organization that Francis Collins started called BioLogos. The Clergy Letter Project, which operates for all faiths, but largely for within the Protestant tradition, set an original goal of getting 1,000 preachers to commit to giving a sermon on the work of Charles Darwin on what we call Evolution Sunday. Darwin was born on February 12th, so the Sunday closest to February 12th is Evolution Sunday. They hope they could get 1,000 clergymen to sign up. The last time I looked at their website, they had 14,000 and growing. So this has turned out to be a widespread movement. BioLogos is an interfaith group that basically tries to make the same argument. And each of these basically share some common ideas. And that is, they basically operate by respecting the competence of science to investigate the natural world, by understanding Scripture as conveying a spiritual message, not a scientific one, by not insisting that science find empirical evidence for a creator God. And the insight that both these organizations share is that God is not in nature waiting to be discovered. God is the reason for nature. And that's an important philosophical distinction. And I would add something personal, and that is a faith that requires, as an article of faith, the rejection of science is simply not a faith worth having. The science is such an important part of the Western tradition. Nonetheless, this argument that science and faith are at loggerheads continues to dominate the public discourse. And I'll give you an example. There's Francis Collins again, Time magazine issue on the day that the human genome sequence was announced for the first time. Collins headed the Public Genome Project. When President Obama nominated Francis Collins to head the National Institutes of Health, Sam Harris, a very well-known atheist writer, penned an impassioned op-ed piece in the New York Times saying this was a mistake. And his logic was as follows. Francis Collins is a Christian. Christians believe a lot of really stupid things. Nobody who believes a lot of really stupid things is qualified to run the National Institutes of Health. That was essentially the argument. I was just incensed. I called up some people I knew at the New York Times. I dashed off a letter. They were kind enough to run it the very, very next day. And my conclusion is he is exactly the right person to head the National Institutes of Health. And the record in the 8 years he's been there is unmistakable. He's done an absolutely splendid job as a scientist and as a person of faith. Now, this is my friend Richard Dawkins, and he is my friend. We've had very good relations over the years. He's plugged my books in the United Kingdom, for which I am very grateful. Richard has written many, many books about evolution, but his all-time best-selling book is actually not about evolution at all. It's The God Delusion, and it's his polemic, if you will, against faith. And one of his best lines, because boy, it nails his point of view, is this one. He says, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." I've had the pleasure of sharing the platform with Richard twice. When I read those lines, I committed them to memory. I met him at a conference at NYU. We were both on the platform together, and I said, "Richard, how do you get up in the morning if you think that this is the nature of the universe?" And you have to imagine this in Oxford accented English with his back arched like this. "Well, the universe may not have a purpose, but I do." Now, how do you reach this conclusion? Well, it's true that the physical universe, especially once you get outside the Earth's atmosphere, seems cold, indifferent, and even hostile to life. That's absolutely true, and he brings that up as part of that argument. But that word purpose really bugs me. How does he know that the universe lacks a purpose? No design, no purpose. Is there a scientific test for purpose? Is there a scientific test for good or for evil? The answer is of course not. If I was to go to the cell biology meetings, which are right in this area in the next couple of days, and when I got my 15 minutes at the platform, if I was to say, ladies and gentlemen, due to experiments in my laboratory, I have discovered the purpose of life, I guarantee you people in the back of the room would say, come here, Greg, Miller's losing it. Everybody knows that science doesn't tell purpose. But Dawkins seems to think that science can detect an absence of purpose, which is just as egregious an error. So there's that quote again. Now, thinking of other people, it's worth pointing out that it isn't a scientific fact, despite what he said about this indifference, that the universe does have exactly the physical and chemical potential to make life possible, indeed to sustain life. So if I was to take other thinkers, such as John Haught, who's right here, Francis Collins, Dobzhansky, a friend of mine named Francisco Ayala, you know what they might say? They might change the quote to this: the universe has the properties we should expect if there is at bottom the wisdom of a provident and purposeful God, intent upon a fruitful and dynamic world that would bring forth life that was reflective, intelligent, and self-aware. Now I want to tell you something. That's not a scientific statement. I can't defend that empirically. But you know what? Dawkins' statement wasn't scientific either. These are simply ways to look at what we know about the scientific facts pertaining to the universe. But many people would say, no, wait a minute now, we physicists over here, we've got our act together. Isn't science approaching an explanation of nature that excludes a deity? A writer who has helped Stephen Hawking write a recent book certainly feels that way. And in fact, in that book, a reviewer wrote, there's nothing special about our universe that explains this. We got the universe we got. According to this view, the universe just came into existence spontaneously, following M-theory's rules. M-theory is string theory, popular, to create physical laws that we call gravity, magnetism, and so just by chance. Not a big deal. We don't need a first cause. And Hawking argues there are rules of nature that do allow the spontaneous creation of multiple independent universes. Now, Hawking's book is kind of difficult. This is a good friend of mine, seriously. Lawrence Krauss, Arizona State University. Lawrence and I made common cause for scientific integrity many times. And Lawrence decided he wanted to popularize this idea. He wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing. The subtitle is Why Is There Something Rather Than Nothing? And he built upon Hawking's idea to basically say, we don't need a first cause. We don't need an explanation for why the universe exists, because universes come into being spontaneously. Richard Dawkins was so excited about this book that he wrote the afterword to it. And I can't quote the whole thing, but here's part of what he wrote. If the origin of species was biology's deadliest blow to supernaturalism, we may see this book as the equivalent from cosmology. The title means exactly what it says, and what it says is devastating. Universes come out of nowhere, and we don't need an explanation for them. Now here's the interesting thing. The most devastating critiques of this book came from atheists like David Albert at Columbia University. And basically, in a review in the New York Times, Professor Albert, I'm going to be crude about this, he tore Lawrence a new one. And he basically says, wait a minute, you made an incredible mistake, and it's a big mistake. And that is neither quantum nor M theory can account for the mechanisms that generate these hypothetical universes. And the way he described it in his review is these universes depend upon the laws of quantum mechanics. Where are these laws supposed to come from? And he writes, Krauss is more or less upfront about not having a clue about that. He acknowledges that before the end of the book. And everything he's been talking about takes the basic principles of quantum mechanics for granted. Universes don't come out of nothing. They come out of these basic laws. Where do they come from? That's the question that basically Krauss and Hawking simply omitted. Now, the interesting thing about this is Lawrence on the internet just went nuts, noting that Albert's a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. Philosophy. What have we ever learned from philosophy? Philosophy's made no progress in 2,000 years. It it doesn't tell us a thing. Lawrence should have Google searched David Albert because he has a PhD in theoretical physics. There's nobody more qualified to critique that book than David Albert. And as it turns out, it's very clear that Albert was right in his criticism. A couple years earlier, another cosmologist, Paul Davies, hit upon the same point. This is an article of his in the New York Times called Taking Science on Faith. And he used to pester his professors in grad school by asking where the laws of physics come from. And the professors would usually say something like, "Go away, kid, you bother me," or "This is not our job." But Davies' insight is something outside of nature is required to explain the laws of nature. And he pointed out with some insight, science has its own faith-based belief system. And it's true. All science proceeds on the assumption that nature is ordered in a rational and intelligible way. And then he says, clearly both religion and science are founded on faith, the existence of something outside the universe like God or an unexplained set of physical laws. For that reason, monotheistic religion and orthodox science both fail to provide a complete account of existence. I would argue that they both fail because we need both to have a complete account of existence. Compatibility of science and faith was a topic a couple of years ago at the World Science Festival in New York. This was the panel discussion on this in which I was honored to participate. I'm over here. This is Lawrence Krauss, and he is my friend. On the other side, he hadn't published his books yet, so we didn't talk about it yet. Here's another snapshot of discussion. Some of you may know this is a very famous philosopher named Colin McGinn. But I want you to notice the guy with the collar on. That is Brother Guy Consolmagno, now the head of the Vatican Observatory. Brother Guy always likes to tell people that he is not a Jesuit priest, he is a Jesuit brother. And for people who are confused about that, he likes to explain it. He says, just like a priest, I can hear your confession, I just can't forgive. He has a PhD from MIT in astrophysics. He wrote a wonderful book called God's Mechanics about the religious beliefs of scientists and technologists. It's a great book. And one of the things he wrote in there, because people are always asking him, you're an astronomer, do you see God through that telescope? You see God in the laws of physics? He said, look, my belief in God is not because of something I've seen in science. I want to turn it around. I believe in science because of my faith in God. His point is this: faith validates science. And my point is that science is strengthened by understanding and support from people of faith. So I want to go back to Professor Barash's column in the New York Times about how religion and science don't get along. And you remember he said evolution has demolished belief in an omnipotent and benevolent God. And he talks about this entirely random and natural process that's got all that's needed to generate extraordinary levels of non-randomness. Living things are complex, but they are entirely within the range of a natural phenomenon. I agree with that. But here's my question. Why is it a problem to point out that life was generated by purely natural processes? I'll quote St. Augustine from the beginning of the 5th century. Augustine wrote, the universe was brought into being in a less than fully formed state, but was gifted to transform itself, that's natural processes, from unformed matter into a truly marvelous array of structure and life forms. I am confident that Augustine would be an evolutionist if he were alive today and was able to see what we have learned ever since. Barash Lanai, no supernatural trait in us. We're perfectly good animals. We are indeed natural as can be, indistinguishable from the rest of the living world in terms of structure and mechanism. He's right. But is it a problem to think that we are part of the natural world? I remember reading a book once that had this line in it. Remember, man, thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return. Charles Darwin didn't write that book. But the person who wrote that book reflected the fact that we are, as Dr. Barash said, an ordinary part of the natural world. And there's that more we know of evolution and that conclusion. It is absolutely true that the process of evolution does not require God as an explanation. But I want to ask you a question. Why should nature be set up in such a way that it supports the extravagant creativity of the evolutionary process? This is not the kind of question that science can answer, but I think faith can. And faith can see this as the work of that very same creator. So my advice to Professor Brosh, if he skipped the talk, focus on biology. If his students really understand the science, they will come to their own reconciliation and leave the preaching to the guys on Sunday. Einstein, not a religious person, appreciated the value of religion. And in fact, one of his quotes, and it's a remarkable one, is, "It's true that science is independent of religious or moral consideration, but those individuals who carried out the great achievements of science were imbued with the truly religious conviction that this universe of ours is something perfect and susceptible to the rational striving for knowledge." That is exactly the faith that Paul Davies was talking about, the faith that the universe is indeed intelligible. So I'm sorry I've gone on so long, but here's my closing points. Faith suffers to the extent that it rejects the gift of understanding that science provides. Science suffers by means of the deep hostility that many scientists display towards any form of faith. And in reality, science and faith both arise from the same human need, which is the desire to understand. And I want to end with a quote from Charles Krauthammer. And I don't know how many of you know him. He's probably the most conservative columnist writing for the Washington Post. When the Kenneth Miller trial was still going on, he wrote this marvelous column. "Phony theory, false conflict. Intelligent design foolishly pits evolution against faith." And he said, how ridiculous it is to make evolution the enemy of God. What could be more elegant, more simple, more brilliant, more divine than a planet with millions of life forms, distinct yet interactive? They all derive from variations in a single double-stranded molecule, pliable and fecund enough to give us mollusks and mice, Newton and Einstein, even if it also gave us the Kansas. And lastly, a couple of years ago, I had the unbelievable privilege, I had to put on special gloves. The American Museum of Natural History unlocked the glass case for me. And I was able to actually pick up the notebook that has this page in it. And it's so rare in the history of science that you can point to notes on a single page and you can say right there, that's where somebody made one of the great scientific discoveries of all time. And this guy wrote down, "I think," and then he drew a kind of tree that no one had ever even imagined before. Then he described the tree down here, and then a couple weeks later, this happened in 1837, a couple weeks later he came back and he wrote some explanatory notes over here. Now the person who kept this notebook didn't think that the idea of evolution, which you actually see right here for the very first time, was demeaning or degrading. He thought quite the opposite. And at the end of a famous book that you've all heard of, he wrote, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on, according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved." That's the concluding sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And ladies and gentlemen, I think those are words to live by. Thank you so much for coming.